Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very excited to bring the conversation I had with Sean Kirkland. Sean is Associate Professor at DePaul University in the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences. He is got his PhD in philosophy from State University of New York at Stony Brook, and he's also been educated in Germany as well. His primary interest is in ancient Greek philosophy, but also works in phenomenology. He's written a handful of books, one which is recently come out, which is called Heidegger's Destruction of Aristotle, on how to read the tradition through Northwestern University Press. Fabulous book, absolutely fabulous book. He also has another book in the works on Aristotle, and it's called Aristotle and Tragic Temporality. He also has other projects in the pipeline, on many of them on the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche. So he stays busy, and he is an absolute gem in terms of sifting through all of this philosophy that many people have worked on for many, many, many years. But I find that his perspective is clear, novel, fresh, and super accurate to the writers and the thinking. And so just an absolute wonderful mind. He is quite brilliant. I absolutely enjoyed reading his book, Heidegger's Destruction of Aristotle. And that's what this conversation is all about. I have told him that he is absolutely welcome to come back on the podcast again, since he has so many other things in the works. So hopefully that will happen. We start by talking about how he came to write this book on Heidegger and Aristotle's philosophy. We talk about the idea of destruction of the philosophical tradition and the differences between positive and negative destruction. We give an overview of Heidegger's philosophy, talk about Dasein, being, existence, being the world, many concepts that I've talked about here in the podcast before. We talk about Aristotle's main concepts, talk about substance and how they persist today. We talk about the threefold aspect of Nietzsche's thought. We talk about how we understand the idea of concepts and what Aristotle means by them. Talk about three tactics of destructive methods. We talk about the phenomenological reduction, construction and destruction. We talk about truth and art, and many other topics. Again, I absolutely loved his book. I love this conversation. It felt really important to have an accurate reading of how these two philosophers engage. And of course, other philosophers are in the mix as well. But it was just in the nitty gritty. I mean, it was in the details. It wasn't, kind of the same old overview of things. It was, we talked about this idea of destruction and positive and negative destruction, what that looks like, how it's misunderstood. And, I found that really fulfilling. I think, many philosophers, they write these big pieces, and it's sometimes just hard to kind of get all of it. And I think when in the corpus of somebody's work, you can take one or two major pieces and just study that your whole life. That's not necessarily what Sean's doing, but I thought it was really nice to talk about this idea of destruction, what that means, what that looks like, have a little bit more accuracy to it, and really just get in the weeds of that and not have to get into all of the overview of everything. And so there's a brief summary of Heidegger and Aristotle's thought, but really just focused on the kind of details of destruction and what that looks like. And so I was really, really encouraged by his work and his book, which is great, and I highly recommend it to everybody. As always, you can find this conversation, all past and upcoming conversations, at convergingdialogues.substack.com. Subscribe, like, engage, share with your friends, all the things. You can do the same for YouTube as well. I'm over there also. And love to hear what people think about this episode or other episodes. So don't be shy. And now I bring you Sean Kirkland. I am here with Sean Kirkland. Sean, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm very much looking forward to talking with you.
Thanks a lot for the invitation, Xavier. Happy
Yeah,
to be
yeah, of course, of course. So I'm very excited for your book coming out that you just finished. It's one of many, I guess, projects you're working on. It's the book is called Heidegger and the Destruction of Aristotle on how to read the tradition. It's a fantastic title. As you see. Yeah, it will make sense once we get into the conversation if people read the book. But talking about the destruction of Aristotle in a title is edgy. So that's great.
yeah, people are already really. It seems like we're in a good cultural moment for destruction. People are really interested. So
that's right. So for folks that don't know who you are, just say what your background's in. You know, what your where you do research, where you've studied at, and all the things that you're thinking and writing about now.
Sure. Thanks, Xavier. So I am a associate professor of philosophy at DePaul University, and my area of specialization is really ancient Greek philosophy primarily, although also 19th and 20th century continental philosophy as sort of a secondary area of specialization. I've published on Plato and Aristotle and pre-Socratics, as well as Greek tragedy. And I'm currently working on a sort of a two projects on Nietzsche. One is a translation of the first volume of the Kritische Studienausgabe brought out by Colli and Montanari. And that includes the birth of tragedy and a bunch of other unpublished texts. And I'm working on that with Andrew Mitchell at Emory University. And in sort of alongside that, I'm also working on a monograph for Edinburgh University Press on the 1873 text that Nietzsche wrote but never completed or published, called Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks. And that was meant to be a sort of sister volume, if you will, to The Birth of Tragedy, where Nietzsche would sort of explain the sources of early Greek, pre-Platonic for him, philosophical thinking along the same lines that he had explained the origins or sources of Greek tragic poetry.
Well, I mean, that's listeners will be like, "Wow, you must do this full time." But I mean, I'm sure that you also are teaching classes as well and have a personal life and all that. So you're fitting all this stuff in between all the other things in your world. So that's pretty outstanding.
Yeah, the personal life part. Yeah, well, but I'm definitely teaching and all the administrative work
Yeah.
that's happening.
Well, I've said it many times here. I'm a big Nietzsche fan. He's one of my favorites, and has been for, I mean, really ever. And so that's just a good excuse to get you back on here at some point when you're ready.
Sounds great.
So the book that you have coming out first is this one on Heidegger and Aristotle. I guess just briefly, you don't have to give me the full, I guess, kind of download for it, but how did you come about not necessarily writing this book, but how did you come to approaching these two philosophers and their work together in this way? Why was this the kind of conceptualization or the angle in which you decided to talk about Heidegger and Nietzsche and Aristotle?
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's a little bit of a kind of maybe it's kind of a autobiography, I guess, that I have another book with Edinburgh University Press right now under review called Aristotle and Tragic Temporality. It's a study of the temporality of human life as it appears in Aristotle's treatment of tragedy in the Poetics. And when I was writing that book, I sort of recalled back to my student days in Wuppertal, Germany. I studied at the Bergische Universität Wuppertal, and I wrote my dissertation under Klaus Held. And I remembered that at that time there was a real, my dissertation was on Plato, and it was a sort of phenomenological interpretation of the early dialogues in Socratic method. But at that time, there were a number of really amazing Heidegger experts on the faculty. In addition to Held, Heinrich Hüni and Peter Travny were there, Georg Siegmann, and a number of other individuals. I think there were four different editors of Gesamtausgabe volumes, Claudia Strube, and I think I'm forgetting someone, but no, maybe that's it.
Yeah, the all-star team there.
Yeah. It was kind of a strange concentration of Heidegger scholarship.
Yeah.
So there were all kinds of seminars on Heidegger and reading groups, and I participated in a lot of those. And I had read a number of these early lecture courses that Heidegger gives in 1920s, before Being in Time comes out, and then in 1927 on Aristotle. And I sort of vaguely recollected them, and I thought, well, I should probably go back to those and take a look. I'm doing a kind of phenomenological interpretation of Aristotle. It's certainly influenced by Heidegger. I should look back into some of those discussions. And when I returned to those, I was looking for specific discussions of Aristotelian concepts or passages that I thought would be interesting. But what I kept being fascinated by was this method of what Heidegger calls in the early 20s destruction. So destruction as a method of interpretation, or destruction as a method of interpreting tradition-bearing texts. So texts that bear or articulate and sort of pass along the tradition we inherit. And that method of reading the tradition and reading the texts of the tradition is what really fascinated me, because I started to realize that it really is a kind of a hermeneutic method. There are strategies to it. There are steps involved in it, and specific tactics one uses to destroy a text, rather than just to read a text closely or to read a text critically. Yeah. Destroying a text with Heidegger means something very specific. And so I sort of became really fascinated with that. And I thought, well, maybe I could write a short sort of treatment of that, because even among really actually serious Heidegger scholars, so not myself, but real Heideggerian scholars, that hadn't been something that I had found in the literature. And the more I investigated, I didn't find people reading destruction as a kind of hermeneutic method, as a method for interpreting texts. I found them sort of situating it in the development of Heidegger's career. How does Heidegger engage with the history of philosophy in order to liberate thinking for some sort of new philosophical project? And so that's how I came to write on Heidegger and his readings of Aristotle specifically, or his destructive readings of Aristotle.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, it isn't something that is at least in the English language, at least on my kind of observation of it, that's talked about that much. And so I might have this wrong, but I've read it somewhere or seen it somewhere that Aristotle is one of the folks that Heidegger lectured on the most, even more than Nietzsche. So I'm sure you've read the two, well, it's 4 volumes and 2 books on lectures by Heidegger on Nietzsche, and a lot of it's on will to power, which is really interesting. And but Aristotle was the most he lectured on. Now I don't know how much of those has been put into some of the full kind of works into English. I'm assuming most of it's in German, but maybe a lot of it is. But yeah, he definitely, I would say, at least for me, and I don't think these two guys are alone in this, but definitely emphasized it, was, both Nietzsche and Heidegger really had a kind of shift, or a kind of a way of trying to say, like, well, we should probably kind of go back and look at all of these pre-Platonic or pre-Socratic philosophers, and then the actual Greeks, and see how we can kind of bring this to the 20th century, if you will. Maybe not exactly that kind of way, in a linear way, but they definitely were interested, more so than I guess the folks that were before them, and trying to implement that in what they were both up to. So I guess the question here is what do you think for Heidegger, just kind of generally, what was it about his about Aristotle's ideas and his philosophy of the world, and of humans, that Heidegger wanted to pull from that, especially with his concepts of Dasein and just ontology in general?
Yeah. So yeah, you're absolutely right that Heidegger, I think, lectured on Aristotle more than any other figure. I think
Yeah.
he offered 12 different lecture courses between 1919 and 1927 on Aristotle, or principally or primarily on Aristotle. So it was really
It's a lot.
and yeah, that's a and extensive readings of
Hmm.
Aristotle in a book length kind of interpretations, effectively, of Aristotle, and the you know somewhat famously the text that sort of pushes Heidegger in the direction of philosophy, in addition to the influence of Husserl.
Hmm.
But already at the age of 17, Heidegger reads. He's on his on a trajectory to enter, really, to be a student of theology, basically, and enter the
Yeah.
seminary.
Hmm.
But the text that he reads is Brentano's, on the many senses of being in Aristotle at 17, and so he has a really long-standing kind of fundamental philosophical interest in Aristotle and Aristotle's discussion of ontology from very early on. And so that's sort of funding some of that interest as well. But more substantively, I think when Heidegger looks back at the tradition, on the one hand, both he and Nietzsche are sort of the recipients of a kind of historicist movement in the 19th century in Germany. That is to say, they're both, from their perspective, thinking is a sort of irremediably historically situated activity. So in thinking, there's no transcending the material and sort of cultural linguistic conditions in which the subject exists to get access to some sort of universal, timeless contents of thought. Instead, thinking is always determined by the cultural, historical, and linguistic context in which it occurs. And so, given that, and given the condition of the cultures they both find themselves in, they look back at the tradition and see the tradition as something that needs to be critiqued. They think that the contents of the tradition that they inherit and that are determining what they're able to think, that requires a kind of critical intervention. And for Heidegger, Aristotle is sort of the fundamental inaugurating figure of that tradition, more so than for Nietzsche. For Nietzsche, he sees really Socrates and Plato as kind of the threshold figures, I think, for the origin of the Western philosophical tradition that he inherits. But for Heidegger, it's Aristotle, primarily because the Aristotelian sort of reception of previous philosophy, so Aristotle's interpretation of the pre-Socratics, Aristotle's interpretation of Plato, his invention of substance ontology. For Heidegger, I think that's what kind of gives the defining set of concepts to both the Middle Ages, the scholasticism of the Middle Ages, and then all the way to the early modern period in through Descartes and rationalism, empiricism. All of that operates with, for Heidegger, fundamentally Aristotelian concepts. And so for Heidegger, the reason that Aristotle is so fundamental is that he takes that Greek tradition and gives it its articulation that then is sort of the definitive influence on the subsequent Western tradition, I think.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. I think that's a great way of explaining it. I guess since we're still here, kind of a little bit on Nietzsche, is my understanding with this is that Heidegger sees everything or most things, I guess, through being some sense of philosophy ontology of sorts. I mean, he just saw that with everything, and I think when people really study and read Heidegger, it makes a lot of sense why he was trying to do that. And so using Aristotle in this way of seeing this as kind of almost a progenitor for how all of the ways in which he wanted to really just, kind of explode with this kind of idea and how essential it was. And then obviously pulling in Husserl's phenomenology. I think with Nietzsche, it was more of, they both liked Heraclitus. They both liked, many of the Greeks. But with Nietzsche, it was more, Nietzsche was less about being, although Heidegger likes to have his interpretation of that, but more so of the kind of aspects of the world, and
Mhm.
aspects of how we are in the space, less so about just who we are as individuals, as humans, within a sense when he's treating the Greeks. Um, so let's talk about destruction. I guess this will be probably important. We can just give a brief overview of Aristotle and Heidegger's major concepts just for review afterwards. But so first, of course, when you were talking about destruction in the beginning of the book, I was like, okay, when are we going to get the reference to Werner Marx? Because you got to talk about Werner Marx, right? And it comes a little bit later, so I'm going to
Mhm.
bring it up here just so we
Mhm.
can have the nice kind of just general overview. You also bring up another favorite of mine, Gadamer. Love Gadamer; he's great. Um, so maybe you can tell us how do we understand this idea of destruction? And if I got this correct, I think for both Werner Marx and Gadamer, they saw destruction as a negative, at least how Heidegger is looking at this. But Heidegger, you're describing, is seeing this as a positive destruction. So
Mhm.
maybe just give us an idea of what is this destruction we're talking about, and then this idea is between a negative and a positive destruction of some of the stuff that Aristotle's doing with tradition.
Sure, Xavier. Yeah. So, yeah, you're absolutely right about Werner Marx and Gadamer sort of perceiving Heidegger's project of destruction as fundamentally and really maybe exhaustively negative. That
Hmm.
it's a preliminary step for both of them. There's a requisite destruction of the tradition we inherit, and then once that tradition's been destroyed, we can think in different terms. We can think differently going forward. And so for them, both the destructive moment is kind of a preliminary moment to the thinking that Heidegger wants to initiate. And I think that's fundamentally wrong. I think for Heidegger, and Heidegger, by the way, repeatedly insists that destruction, although the initial sense of the word seems predominantly negative,
Yeah.
um, he insists over and over again that that destruction is actually positive. He says in Being and Time something like, "To bury the past in nullity is not the purpose of this destruction, this method of destruction. Its aim is positive." And so that was kind of one of the fundamental questions of the book that you're focused in on, is in what way is Heidegger's engagement with the texts of the tradition that he calls destruction fundamentally positive? What's the positive gain that is actually produced by destruction itself? Not just how does destruction prepare the ground for some positive project of thinking, but how is destruction itself positive? How can Heidegger justify that claim? And the basic the basic so both Marx and Gadamer see that destruction as sort of a engaging with the text of the tradition of philosophy on a certain ground. Marx says that, in this book, Heidegger und die Tradition, Heidegger and the Tradition, it's very clear that for Marx, that "and" is a disjunctive "and." It means Heidegger's one thing and the tradition's another. And I think, like I said, I think that's fundamentally wrong. Marx says what Heidegger wants to do is take philosophy in a different direction and move it into a different dimension than the tradition has operated in. And again, I think that's wrong. I think what Heidegger wants to do is dig back into those texts of the tradition. And this is, in order to sort of follow him in this path, we really have to emphasize what has not previously been emphasized. That is, that this destructive method is not a culture critique or something broad and sort of airy like that. It's a very precise method for reading tradition-bearing texts. And insofar as it does that, what Heidegger wants to do over and over again is, and most centrally in the text of Aristotle, read those texts, find the concepts that Aristotle is articulating in those texts, the concepts that then will be passed along into the tradition, developed, reflected on, associated with other concepts, applied, etc., all the way down to us. So Heidegger wants to identify those concepts and the definitions that they take on, and then he wants to dig down in those texts in the places where he finds a trace of the experiential ground out of which those concepts are being articulated. So moments in the Aristotelian text where Aristotle is indicating the experience that he's having preconceptually, and out of which then he's going to develop a new concept, the concept of essence, the concept of a definition. Aristotle gives us our concept of a definition, what a definition is, the concept of an idea that Plato gives us. These kind of moments where a concept is articulated for the first time and then passed along into the tradition, that's the textual space where Heidegger wants destruction to operate. And finally, this is kind of a long-winded answer, but what the positive gain is that by digging down to that experiential ground, which there's just traces of, just the meagerest sort of indications of in the text, Heidegger hopes to find the originating source out of which that concept was generated. And lastly, a source that the concepts don't themselves fully incorporate. So that's being. It's the source of the appearing of beings to Aristotle, in relation to which Aristotle thinks and generates a concept of being, but that subtending ground for the subtending sort of dynamic event of the emergence and appearance of beings, that is being, that's what Aristotle experiences but fails to think. And so that's the place where Heidegger wants to dig in and say, okay, let's destroy Aristotle's text in the sense that we show that those concepts fail to incorporate the ground that they're trying to conceptualize. And then we have a new opportunity to think out of that very ground for a second time. And I think that's the positive moment, is finding that ground of beings back in the texts of Aristotle or back in the texts of our tradition, and then having the opportunity in that destructive moment to think out of that ground a second time.
Yeah, that's very very nicely put. I have many follow-ups here. So so it seems, and I would agree based on how I've read Heidegger as well. I don't think that he's trying to do a type of another offshoot of philosophy, or he's trying to do. I think he's trying to go through all of the tradition. Just for clarity, tradition being anywhere from the pre-Socratics all the way up to present day with Heidegger at the time. So you're going to get Hume and Hegel and Descartes, and if you will, Western, I guess you could say, tradition. And trying to find that essence, because you see like that the destruction piece is we're stripping all this. We're going to look at Aristotle. We're going to strip all this away and get to the essence of what he's saying, where being is instantiated in, but not necessarily verbalized. And this is where the Husserl kind of phenomenology comes in, of what is this kind of experience? He's talking about these things, or he's talking about definitions or concepts, substance, things like that. But what is the actual foundation for that, right? And so this is where the positive feature comes in. It's not in like a kind of deconstruction postmodern kind of thing where we're just gonna break it all down into parts until we break it all down into parts. There's more of, we're gonna basically, this kind of essentially the phenomenological, uncover or unveil or unmask all of this stuff that we already have talked about for thousands of years in if it's for the Greeks and everyone after that, to try and get at what it is there that's residing in being. Now, this isn't a way to try and necessarily understand exclusively for Aristotle the author's intent, but just what the experience of that being resting within whatever he's trying to describe in whichever text, correct?
That's a great point, Xavier. So yeah, I think that's right. That in a strange way, there's a really challenging ontology of the text at work in Heidegger's destructive method of reading. That is, in a very real way, he finds there's a sort of ambivalence in the text. He finds Aristotle thinking being as it's showing itself in 4th century BCE Greece, so Aristotle's thinking that being, and he's generating the concepts of Western metaphysics that will be passed along and dominate thought subsequently in the West. But in the text, there is more than what Aristotle is thinking. So there's even more than what Aristotle is experiencing. There's indications only for the destructive reader that there's an excess to the being that shows itself to Aristotle. So when being shows itself to Aristotle, it shows itself as the presence of present entities, right? So being is the way in which present entities exist. It's their mode of being. So it's exclusively belongs to the sum total of all beings, right? That the being is distributed among all beings, and being is their way of existing. And that's how Aristotle thinks beings and their being. But Heidegger thinks in the Aristotelian text, there are these indications of an excess to that understanding of being. So there's more in the text than what the text says for the destructive reader. It's not there for Aristotle. Aristotle isn't thinking that ground. He's responding to that, the manner in which being gives itself. And in his response, we can see, or we can destructively reveal being's withdrawal from that way of showing itself. And in that moment, then we kind of have just a strange notion of the text. The text is both what Aristotle's written to record his thoughtful reception of being and the appearance of beings, and yet it also has, for the destructive reader, more than that. And that's what we reveal ultimately as the ground. And this is the reason that when Heidegger goes back to those early thinkers, he's always interested in Grundbegriffe, so fundamental or grounding concepts, or Grundprobleme, fundamental or grounding problems. It's that emphasis on the ground out of which the concept emerges, or the ground out of which that he's trying to get to. We have Aristotle thinking the concepts of Western metaphysics and generating them, but we also have that fundamental underlying ground that is not totally integrated into the text or incorporated into the text, but yet we find evidence for it in our destructive reading.
So that all tracks. That makes sense, especially the grounding piece. So is this where, as you said a little bit ago, that this positive destruction Heidegger's doing with, in this case, Aristotle's works, is a type of hermeneutic, right? That the as opposed to in the way that Werner Marx and Gadamer say this is a kind of just, well, he's just breaking this stuff up and doing his own thing. No.
Right.
Positive destruction in itself is a type of hermeneutic that Heidegger's trying to, not just a different type of hermeneutic, because obviously Gadamer was also very much, he's in his own right. I mean, fantastic at philosophical hermeneutics, but more so of doing the positive destruction as a type of hermeneutic to understand the being within the text and the essence that is there as well. Is it this kind of motivation for Heidegger on this piece as a hermeneutic?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right, Xavier. So it is a kind of a method of interpretation that, and the principle of which is that by revealing this tension between the level of concept and the level of the register of concept and the register of experience in the Aristotelian text, by sort of amplifying that tension, we can find the subtending ground of being, which is the condition for being showing themselves to Aristotle and being thinkable. They're appearing to him, but which itself doesn't appear to him, and which itself doesn't appear in the text. And that's probably a good place to shift to. You'd asked earlier about the kind of phenomenological aspect of Heidegger's project, and I think in one way he's really thinking Aristotle as himself a kind of proto-phenomenologist. So he sees Aristotle as thinking fundamentally phenomenologically. Aristotle, rather than thinking in the mode of modern philosophy from Descartes on, which is always trying to bridge the gap between the subject as the site for thinking and objective reality as an independently existing region, which may or may not be connected to the content of my subjective experience. And that project is what dominates all of modern philosophy after Descartes. For Heidegger, Aristotle's engaged in a fundamentally different philosophical project. He's not worrying about the subject-object split. He hasn't encountered Cartesian hyperbolic doubt. He's simply thinking appearances. He's beginning with appearances as a absolutely legitimate place to begin thinking. Now, that doesn't mean that everything that appears in ordinary everyday experience is true. It just means that it's an okay place to start thinking. You have to then subject those appearances to scrutiny. You have to analyze them. You have to subject them to definition. You have to clarify them. You have to interpret them. But nonetheless, appearances for Aristotle, for Heidegger's Aristotle, are the appearances of what is. And that's the place to begin thinking. And that's what Heidegger believes as well in his own phenomenological study of, say, the analytic of Dasein in Being and Time. That's the kind of phenomenological commitment that Heidegger's own thinking exhibits, right? That what is appearing is those are the appearances of what is, and we need to begin there, and then the project of philosophizing can clarify what it is that's appearing to Dasein, which is beings, and the being that is the ground of that appearing.
Yeah, I think so. That makes a lot of sense. I think it will be helpful here. We'll kind of. I want to get to still continue with this idea of destruction, and then get into more of the weeds here that you talk about in the book, because it's super fascinating. So we can just we'll step back a bit and just give for listeners. So if listeners have listened to other conversations I've had here, I've talked about Heidegger's philosophy a lot here. So from your perspective, though, how do you typically explain the basic features of Heidegger's philosophy? We could do the same with Aristotelian concepts, and then we can kind of shift there. So I'll set you up here, and then you can take as much runway as you want.
Sure.
But so with Western continental philosophical thought, you have Husserl, Edmund Husserl, who is the godfather of phenomenology. In fact, Heidegger took his place at the rectorship. They had a great relationship until they didn't, for many terrible reasons, which I've talked about in other places. So Heidegger, Being in Time is dedicated to Edmund Husserl. They were very much, kind of master apprentice, however way you want to talk about it. And so super impacted, influenced, at least, Being in Time and early Heidegger by Husserl. So phenomenology to the things themselves, right? Trying to just strip away being object subject, just trying to get the experience of things. So there's that whole piece of it. So in this process, partly, Heidegger's philosophy develops with all these interesting ideas and concepts, such as Dasein. You can explain what that is. Existence, beings. Dasein and being is a little bit different. And then also, we can also talk about Verfallenheit, the thrownness, or the fallenness, excuse me. So he has all these concepts about trying to understand at core what it is to be essentially human, or to exist, and what that experience is at bottom. So he himself will take a lot of time and a lot of ink on pages to figure out what that is at it's very essential pieces. And then you start seeing all this other stuff that he brings in from the tradition. So just kind of give us the kind of you can also talk about being in the world here and worldhood. So that's some really fascinating stuff as well.
Mhm.
Just kind of give your, overview of Heideggerian kinds of thought, because that will be helpful then as we keep, trying to understand what he's describing about the destruction of tradition and some of the Aristotelian texts based in his framework of his philosophy. So just give us the overview that you feel is best helpful there.
Sure. Yeah. And so it is important to just mark the fact that when Heidegger's terminology moves away from phenomenology to as a term to describe his method, which is immediately after Being in Time in 1927, and Heidegger starts using different terminology for his project. And the best book on that, by the way, is Will McNeill, my colleague here at DePaul, Will McNeill's book, The Fate of Phenomenology. So
Nice.
for tracing Heidegger's kind of continued commitment, but radicalization and transformation of phenomenology.
Is this the so-called turn in the 30s or whatever
Yep.
it is?
Yeah, exactly. And part of that turn, at least, is Heidegger's sort of abandoning phenomenology as a term to describe his own method, but then also abandoning the discourse of phenomenology that we saw in Being in Time and previous to that, and beginning to pursue philosophy in a kind of a different mode. And that is simultaneous with his abandoning of the term destruction. After 1927, he doesn't talk about destroying the history of being anymore. He talks about sort of the engaging in the history of being, and pursues that in various forms. So the phenomenology and destruction have a kind of similar fate in the development of Heidegger's career. But so in terms of the way that Heidegger takes Husserlian phenomenology and kind of radicalizes it or changes it fundamentally, I think when we could focus. You brought it up, Xavier. This insistence on the role, referring to what previously would have been called the subject, the human subject or the human being, in terms of Dasein. So this terminology of Dasein, which is a pre-existing German term that Kant would have understood to mean something like existence or something, but for Heidegger, he really wants to unpack it etymologically. That he wants to understand it as Dasein, being there, right? Da means there, Sein means being. So he really wants to understand and that is for him the starting point of philosophizing. Like the best description for where philosophical reflection begins is being there for Heidegger. So first of all, that is a replacement for this terminology of subject and object, right? So he wants to take which etymologically would relate back to, right, sort of Latin terms subjectum and objectum, which are both, right? So yectum comes from the verb jacere, which is to throw or cast or put something, and subject or subjectum, subject, is the thing that's put under the various properties that a thing possesses. So what the Greeks would have called the hypokemenon, the underlying thing, and that's the subject. But for the philosophy of the modern period, the subject is really the thing that's put under all of the contents of thought, right? All the contents of experience or thought. The subject is that res cogitans, that thinking thing that sits beneath all of that and possesses all the contents of consciousness. And then you have the objectum, which is the thing cast or put over against, against the subject. And so that etymology leaves us beginning philosophy from the position of a subject set over against and divided from the objective reality, the independent reality it's trying to think. Right, and that separation, interestingly, that threat of a utter severance between the subjective contents of thought and reality, that separation constitutes what the subject and what the object are. It's the threat of that separation that actually make the subject what it is and make the object what it is in terms of an interpretation of reality, an interpretation of thinking, or a way of conceptualizing the project of thinking. So Heidegger says that those presuppositions, the presupposition of that gap, the presupposition of those two opposed subjectum and objectum, I want to put that aside, and because that isn't actually the content of our experience. When you experience the world, you don't experience yourself as a subjectum, as a subject. The subject doesn't actually appear in experience. When you're looking out your window, when you're thinking about philosophical concepts, when you're having any kind of experience whatsoever, the subject isn't there. It's not in the experience. It doesn't show up. And so Heidegger thinks, well, why would we presume to be subjects set over against by a threatening severance or gap an objective reality? What does show up is being there. And what he means there is he's sort of emphasizing a kind of being situated in relation to a surrounding, enveloping field, for lack of a better term. Yeah. And that is true to our experience, right? Before we assume anything about experience, the reality of any of the features of what we're experiencing, we realize that structurally our experience is one where we are situated within this surrounding, enveloping field within which things show up or come into existence or pass away or draw our attention or don't. But that field, that being in relation to that field, is fundamental to experience. And so Heidegger says, let's start there. And that's really what being in the world is, because that the sort of ordinary everyday term that we would use for that whole encompassing, enveloping field in which we find ourselves is the world. That's the world. We're in the world. But what's insisted on when we begin from Dasein rather than a subject-object relation is that when we start thinking, we already have the world. The world's always already appearing to us. That there is available to us. It's shown itself to us. And that's the world we're trying to think and better understand and situate ourselves in and take action within. And so on the one hand, you can think of that way of having the world always already as the world's appearing to you. It's always having shown itself to you as that there within which you're situated. Or you can think of yourself as sort of stretching out into that world, right? Sort of extending out into that world. And that's the notion of the being of Dasein as existence, right? That's from ek, the prefix out, and sistera, the Latin term sistera, which is to stand. So existence for Heidegger is a standing out into the world, kind of stretching out into that world. And Heidegger just means something as easy as when you're existing in the world, you're kind of you're extending out in beyond what's immediately present to you, in all kinds of ways. Like when I just heard the postman drop off letters at my front door as I'm sitting here, and the fact that I would perceive that person as a postman, right, entailed by that perception of this person right in front of me is all the other houses in the block that they're delivering to, right? They're not my dedicated postman. I realize that they're a postman that delivers to the whole neighborhood. Also, the whole system of the postal service that's supporting them in their activity. Also, all the other addresses on the planet where that mail could come from. All of that is entailed in my perception of this person as postman. And so in that way, my experience is already stretched out to the limits of the entire world. It's already existing, stretching out into the world. And lastly, Xavier, I would just add this, that includes temporally, right? So here we get the temporality of Dasein, that my way of existing isn't to be sort of pinched in this present moment and existing in a self-contained, isolated sort of mode, but rather I'm always stretched into the past. I'm emerging out of a past into this moment. You've mentioned thrownness. I'm thrown into this moment. All what happened to me 10 minutes ago, what happened to me an hour ago, what happened to me yesterday, all the way back to the whole tradition that stretches back. All that is emerging into me at this moment. And then I'm projecting into the future, right? I'm making plans to do X, Y, and Z. I'm doing this. I'm stepping out my front door because I'm on my way to campus, et cetera. All of that projecting and sort of falling into the present, that emerging out of a past, that sort of is an existing way of being, right? I'm stretched beyond myself in my presence. So that's the place that Heidegger thinks that's where thinking starts, right? It's not a subject-object relation. It's in that situated being in the world where we begin to think, and that's the phenomenon. The last thing I would say is just in terms of his inheritance of Husserlian phenomenology. For Brentano and Husserl, the fundamental feature that they initially recognized about consciousness when Husserl was engaging in more sort of philosophical psychology was that consciousness is intentional. Right, that intentionality is a basic structural feature of consciousness. Whether I'm fearing something, I'm always fearing something. If I'm hoping, I'm always hoping for something. Even if I'm imagining or fantasizing, I'm imagining something. And so that intending character of consciousness, Husserl said, that belongs to consciousness as such. So now we can study the objects that consciousness is directing itself toward. We can come to understand them better. For Heidegger, that directionality, that relationality that Husserl and Brentano first recognized and referred to as intentionality, it's not so much an object that consciousness is fundamentally directed to, it's the world. Yeah. The world is what we're directed to and related to in a fundamental structural sense for Heidegger. And that's the important sort of focus of his kind of phenomenological investigations, I would say.
Yeah, you summarize it wonderfully, and for listeners, many times his writing is very, I don't know, kind of dry and a little dense, and
Sure.
it's hard to get all that out of it. But I think if you stick with it, he definitely is someone, especially being in time, you need a couple reads. So you're not going to get the first read, you're not going to get the second read, but slowly you start to get there. But I think listeners can see the absolute, just how tremendous that kind of thinking is, and
Sure.
the grand scale of of the project he was trying to do about the Dasein. He says that, I believe this is right, that the world or worldhood is wrapped up in Dasein, right? It's this idea that we get the world we're experiencing ensconced in how we're in the world, not as an outsider or an observer, and we're in the world. And so the world is wrapped up in it. And that's why he spends time in the beginning part, I think it's the first part of Being in Time, talking about the different types of world, what we mean by that, right? There's worldhood, there's different types of world, and that's, I think that's super important, because we don't always think of it that way, but we do talk about it that way, though. And there's the world of academia or the campus.
Right.
There's the world
Right.
we live in as a planet. There's the world of whatever, and we kind of talked about that already. But there is different, I guess you could say, ways of extending out, or is existing in these types of worlds. But all of that is within Dasein, of us being there. It kind of this in the world, as opposed to outside of it or observing it. And so then the directionality aspect of space and time makes sense, because then it's like, well, these things then are outside of me. They're happening to me and with me. And so then my understanding of existing, or understanding me at bottom, is there's a kind of a directionality within this kind of space and time. It's less so of this is outside of me. And that has a very different way of trying to understand, well, not just understanding existence, but understanding then all the potential value you could derive, or the things you could do, if you're formulating a way of how you are in the world, in those kinds of in that manner of looking at time in that manner.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and Yeah, and so obviously he goes on to write about other things, anxiety and death and care and all
Hmm.
these really, really wonderful concepts that are interesting for us to know. And then you can derive from that, personally, ways in which you want to understand how one could live their life, things like that. So there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of power in his mind, his philosophical mind for sure.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. No, I think that's right, and I think you're right, Xavier, about the his it, the critique, for instance, of a kind of scientific or theoretical mode of experience that Heidegger gives us in Being and Time. The idea that what we sort of imagine is that um, we grasp something most completely as what it is when we relate to it in that sort of scientific theoretical mode, that we stop um, our kind of worldly way of being, our sort of ordinary everyday way of being, and we suspend that, and we just focus in on the object and trying to identify the properties that it possesses. And we imagine that that's the way of really cracking that thing open. And now we've really gotten it about that. We've studied it scientifically. We've studied it objectively, and now we've really figured it out. We don't have, it's not all the kind of hippy dippy associations or fluffy kind of ways of relating or caring about something or not. All of that's been suspended, and we're just getting the objective properties of the thing and listing it. And that's knowing it as it is. And what Heidegger shows in Being and Time is that's actually a secondary mode of relating to things. That's what we end up with when we sort of suspend our ordinary project-oriented activities in the world. That's the more fundamental, and it's taking that more fundamental way of looking at or interacting with the world and interacting with beings, and taking something out of it that's required to arrive at that scientific understanding or theoretical understanding. And I think that's a really profound revelation, because in our day and age, no one thinks for a second that anything other than science, well, almost no one thinks for a second that anything other than science is the right way to get at the truth of things. We think the scientific gaze is the privileged way to arrive at truth, and that seems to have been pretty definitively decided, although it does seem to be being called into question by people in the last maybe not too long a period of time, in a way that I for one didn't expect. But nonetheless, if you were to ask, how do we get to the truth of the matter? Say we're having a government investigation into some phenomenon, and we want to determine how the government should respond. We wouldn't pull together a panel of poets or philosophers, for that matter. We'd pull together a bunch of social scientists and other scientists, and we'd have them take a look at it, and then they'd give us a scientific report, and then we'd think, oh, we got to the bottom of it because we approached it scientifically. And Heidegger in Being and Time shows us that maneuver is actually taking something out of our richer, more immediate, more connected experience of the world, and so it thrives on a reduction rather than an increase. And I think that is a really powerful observation.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree. I mean, it really was. I think for me, as someone that it has been within the social sciences with psychology, I read Being in Time, kind of, I guess, completely. I had read bits and pieces of it, but completely in somewhere in grad school. When I was in grad school for psychology, not obviously philosophy, and it just kind of, and reading other folks, where it just kind of hit me like a ton of bricks. I was just like, oh,
Yeah.
all of
Yeah.
this feels not as important as I thought it was. Um,
Well,
that said, the scientific method
yeah,
is fantastic, and we
I
should
agree.
still keep doing that. And you're
I
not
agree.
saying that we shouldn't. I'm not saying we shouldn't.
Yeah.
But I do think that the way I explain this to folks is, when you want to do a scientific study, you usually you start with a hypothesis, or you can start with observations and then make a hypothesis. And that's somewhere in the mix. And I think the thing to question there is, from where does the hypotheses arise? Now,
Hmm.
again, you could talk about Bayesian priors and all these things, and there's many
Right.
wonderful things about predictive modeling within computational neuroscience, which to me is just you know neuroscience is just catching up to what Heidegger really had thought 100 years ago. But yes, I think that it's you're trying to understand where is this coming from, where where those questions, those potential hypotheses are coming from based on your input from the world is coming from somewhere. Now, if you,
Hmm.
you want to do the Freudian thing, there's the unconscious, but there's this idea of there's some phenomenological what reason or insight there of I'm going to ask this question about these phenomena in the world
Hmm.
and that's going to be different for everybody, and that's
Right.
coming from one's own Dasein. It's coming from their own experience in the world, right?
Hmm.
And that's important, I think to take seriously. I think
Hmm.
because many people will say, well, you know, this and this, I would hypothesize that, there's an increase here. That's because of these, variables, and this may or may not correlate. So we'll run the stats and we'll try and figure it out. But that's coming from a type of, whether you recognize it or not, consciously or unconsciously, a philosophical framework in your mind.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
And that's important to at least examine slowly or more critically of, well, why am I considering this hypothesis and not
Yeah.
other ones? And why would I want to see the potential correlatory, aspects between these variables? That is a different type of question. And I think,
Hmm.
so it doesn't mean you have to throw the scientific method out.
Yeah.
Again, you're not saying that. I'm not saying that. We must still keep doing that. That's very good to do. But I think
Hmm.
we should also place some value on the precursor to many of those things before we get to the methods and the results and the conclusion. All of the precursors for that.
Hmm.
What do you think
Yep.
about that?
Yeah, I agree completely, and with everything. Yeah, that you just said. I think there's a, I think the philosophical justification for that. I mean, there is a sort of a common sense way of saying about, yeah, if the science is being in any way directed or constrained or influenced by those precursors, then it as science it has to take those into consideration, right? In order to be good science, it has to um, take those up. And I think the philosophical justification for why those influences or sort of pre decided directives or what have you. The reason for taking those seriously from a Heideggerian philosophical perspective is that, once again, we're not subjects where the content of our subjective experience might be cut off from reality, that it might be just a merely subjective whim or a merely subjective mood or something like that. For Heidegger, that notion uh, uh, of the agent of thinking is not a subject. It's once again Dasein, which means that those pre-philosophical, pre-scientific ways that the world has shown itself to you, those are real ways that the world is revealing itself. That is reality giving itself to you, and you stretching out to reality already with interests and directions and curiosities there and not there. That is a real relationship between the thinking subject or the thinking Dasein and the reality that they're trying to think. It's not a merely subjective pre-scientific influence. It's the world showing itself to you, and so that for that reason it should be taken seriously, right? Because it's
Mhm.
a real connection to the world. Now it has to be subject to reflection and philosophical
Of course,
questioning. We
yeah, of
figure out
course.
what it means, and what we're going to take from it philosophically and scientifically. But for Heidegger, it's unquestionable that is the world showing itself. That's the where he begins thinking.
Yeah, yeah, no, I fully agree. So let's do I guess the overview a little bit of kind of the Aristotelian concepts. I mean, obviously he wrote in a different style and in a different time. But I guess the question here, which is kind of going off what you just said, is for Aristotle, how do we see Aristotelian concepts still in our world, right? At this pre-reflective, pre-scientific level? You can give the example of ousia, right? Of
Yep.
substance, and how much of Aristotle's thought has foundations of contemporary science built into it. When we were talking earlier, I was had a conversation not that long ago about, it was more of a historical conversation, but talking about how much in the Middle Ages, I believe it is, where when you get to folks like Thomas Aquinas, where they're using Greek philosophy, and I believe Aristotle,
Hmm.
and there was a big Plato Renaissance in a certain I don't know if it's the 11th or 12th century, where there was this kind of, let's go back to the Greeks, let's go back to what they're saying, and then incorporate it. And a lot
Hmm.
of now, this is a whole other conversation for something else, but you do get a lot of that smuggled into certain aspects of modern theology, or more modern
Hmm.
theology in this millennium. And there's a whole debate about how much of Christianity is in Western thought, or Western thoughts in Christianity, and how that
Hmm.
impacts us, even if we aren't religious anymore, et cetera, et cetera. Which
Sure.
there's
Yeah.
plenty of conversations about that. But I guess my question here for Aristotle specifically is, how do his concepts still impact us in contemporary science and in the world today? And again, substance might be a good example here if you want to use that.
Sure. Yeah. No, I agree. And I think maybe it's good to identify kind of two registers
Sure.
on which that experience might unfold. Right. On the one hand, there is the conscious register of, right, sort of, as you mentioned, scholasticism, Aquinas, et cetera, returning to the text of Aristotle and really trying to interpret it as a pre-revelation, pre-Jesus Christ study of God's creation, which then should, in principle, if it's a successful interpretation of the order of reality, it should help us to understand how we should behave in this world, even though he didn't have the benefit of the Bible and Jesus's teachings and etc. So for Aquinas, there's a reason to specifically go back to Aristotle as kind of the philosopher, the philosophical, the pagan philosophical articulation of the structures of the natural world. So that's and that continued on through modern philosophical period and in modern science and et cetera. So that sort of conscious explicit returning to the ancients, but even much more profound than that is the sort of subtending, unconscious, always prior manner in which our experience is organized according to fundamental concepts that were invented by Aristotle, and that were then developed and that we receive, and that are the structures of intelligibility that are always already operative in the way we experience the world, the way the world shows itself to us. This sort of traditional influence that's beneath the level of our subjective or our reflection, right? So even if we don't know who Aristotle is, or we don't
Yeah.
know where these concepts come from, they're already there at work organizing our experience. And so I do this thought experiment with my students a lot of times. I'll say, okay, so try to let's do this experiment. Let's without trying to be reflective or clever or interesting or philosophical, let's just sort of suspend that, but let's try to make a list of what in this room has being, what is in this room. And just start making a list, and we'll see, what they'll give them a couple of minutes and they'll start making a list of things, and inevitably they come up with things like this table, this chair, maybe that person, maybe the blackboard, and the world of their experience fundamentally organizes itself into Aristotelian substances. Scientifically, we might think, well, that's just a kind of epiphenomenal structure of the world. Really, what's structuring the world is relations of energy or relations of subatomic particles and then atomic particles and et cetera. That's really what the world is made of. But we don't experience the world in those terms. We don't experience the world as a field of energy. We don't experience the world as a set of relations. Maybe we could, where relations are primary and substances result from those relations. We might be able to imagine experiencing the world that way. And maybe somebody who is not as thoroughly influenced by the tradition of Aristotelian ontology or metaphysics that we inherit, maybe they do experience the world in fundamentally different ways. But for us, we experience the world as a collection of Aristotelian ousiai, or substances. And for Aristotle, he's the one that came up with the idea after Plato, right? He's Plato's student. Plato says the things that are real can't be these changing, shifting material things that populate this world that we immediately experience. What is most of all must be the ideas, right? These eternal, timeless, these unchanging, perfect, intelligible entities. They are real, and this world is just a pale, imperfect imitation of that one, right? But Aristotle says, no, that's not right. The world that's most real are the world of individual substances. That is, a hylomorphic compound, a compound of a certain amount of suited material in a form, like the form of a horse or the form of a human or the form of a tree. And those things are what's most real, are those hylomorphic compounds he calls substances. And that's the world that we still experience, right? He was, and I'm not saying that Aristotle made the Western tradition be a substance ontology grounded tradition. I'm saying, as the world was showing itself in 4th century Greece as a collection of substances, Aristotle was the best, clearest sighted, most articulate recorder of that mode of appearing. And so that's an example of the way that the world continues to fundamentally organize itself according to Aristotelian principles. And then it's out of that experience that scientists think. No matter if, Aristotelian principles have been rejected. We don't any longer believe in a teleological view of nature. We've rejected the idea of an infinite time, right? So we have all these other we've even rejected Aristotelian logic with its replacement in the late 19th century with a mathematical logic. All of that may be the case, but our fundamental experience is organized by substance ontology. And when a scientist begins their thinking, they think from out of that experience into the scientific principles that they adhere to when they're proceeding in their physics, study in physics, study in psychology, study in any other scientific endeavor. It's ultimately grounded in the individual scientist's lived experience of the world, organized by Aristotelian concepts.
Yeah, I think it's again, I mean, he's, tremendous for how he lives on in our world in many ways of how we think about just the very basic fundamentals. I've mentioned this at different points before, but if you've never seen Toy Story 4, you definitely should.
I haven't.
There's
No,
it's great because it talks about a lot of these big concepts. In the movie, there's a child that is at a daycare and has to make something,
Mm.
make something. So there's there's a present at hand and there's readiness to hand, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
and and she takes a spork, right?
Right.
And puts other materials, other substances, right? And gives him, I think, what is it? Not toothpicks. The things that you have for like popsicles, they're wooden.
Oh yeah, like a popsicle stick.
The popsicles, yeah, and those are
Yeah.
the 2 feet, and like the kind of red things for the arms, and the googly eyes on the thing, and whatever. And all of a sudden, it becomes mm, alive, I guess you could say,
Hmm.
and it talks and it walks,
Hmm.
but it's trying to understand what it is.
Right. Right. Yeah.
And it says, and it's very funny, right? It's, the character's name becomes Forky, I think is the name of the
Mm,
character. And he has these big conversations with Woody about what it means to be and what it means to
right.
exist. And he keeps saying, "Well, I'm trash," right? Because he
Yeah.
was found in the trash. It's
Right.
very funny, but
Yeah.
if you really set outside the film and the contours of the film, it's asking really big questions about what it means to be, what it means to
Sure.
exist, how we're
Yeah.
made of substances, how we aren't. You know, what is that like, and how is that different of existing?
Mm,
Um, and so, anyways, it's a
yeah.
very, I'm sure you could pull and play with a lot of ways of teaching concepts. I mean, it is a very like clear, like, yeah, present at hand kind of
Yeah.
materials. I mean, it's very, very, at least for me, it's
Yeah.
very, very obvious.
Yeah.
It's really, really interesting. So, but anyways, this
Well,
idea of substances is like, it lives on with many things in
sure.
which we're doing.
Yeah, and Aristotle would have a way of thinking about that, right? He distinguishes the mode of being of what is often translated as a heap, sort of just a random collection of things stuck together,
Hmm.
versus a substance. And he wants to say,
Yeah.
so a pile of leaves is not a substance, right? The pile is not a substance. Each individual leaf might be a substance. And the way he would answer that question is, well, the substance has a function,
Yeah.
whereas the pile of leaves doesn't have a function. So
Yeah. Yeah.
Forky probably would have some kind of a function. Maybe he's a member of the community, does things. I don't
That's
know.
what happens is much like, Buzz and Woody were toys.
Right,
They were toys for a person, and they
right.
and their continuous story is, well, like the powerful message of Toy Story 3 is, what does it mean to belong to somebody,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
And some attachment there, even with for what's the kid's name? I don't remember the kid's name in Toy Story, but the kid that has the inanimate objects that he plays with and anything like that. But then the question becomes, well, what's my what is it worth existing if it's not for this person? Could I exist for other children and in
Mhm,
other
mhm.
ways? And
Sure,
what's my
yeah.
purpose and meaning? And trying to find that.
Mhm.
There's a big existential question in the third film, but then they go all the way back to like, what does it mean to actually be a
Yeah,
toy? Because if you're not a toy, you're just literally trash that was
right,
thrown together and then you make it.
right,
What does it mean to really be a toy?
right.
What does it
Yeah,
mean to be a toy for someone?
sure.
Right.
Yeah.
But anyways,
Interesting.
this is
Interesting.
when I when I go and see movies with my daughter. This is what's going on in my head, right? She's just loving the movie, but this is what this is what I'm thinking
Yeah,
about. I'm thinking
right.
about ontology and substance. And all these.
It's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a great film, Dad. Yeah, it really was a great
Yeah.
film. Let me tell you why I think it's a great film. Like, oh gosh,
Oh no, not that again. Yeah.
that's right. Um, so I want to ask you about concepts.
Mhm.
Before we get to concepts, let's take. I guess this will be. You mentioned it in the book, but so I will be important, but maybe it'll register in this conversation as a type of footnote. So I obviously want to ask you is, you mentioned Nietzsche's threefold critical approach to history,
Mhm.
which is really interesting. I can't remember where you pulled this. If this was from the Untimely Meditations, or if this was
Mhm.
from
Yep.
Birth of
Yep.
Tragedy, or both. I think it's Untimely Meditations, all right?
Yep. Second untimely meditation. Yep. That's right.
Fantastic. So good. So good. Um, how does his kind of threefold critical approach, kind of connect or overlap, or I guess I should say, how does Heidegger's approach overlap with Nietzsche's threefold critical approach from looking at a way of looking at of history and tradition, and they both were
Mhm.
very much interested in this. And
Mhm.
so, where do you see the overlap or maybe the divergence of their kind of work here on this?
Yeah. No, I do see a lot of overlap and a kind of a shared sensibility. And Heidegger himself mentions the second untimely meditation and being in time in the discussion of history and historicity of Dasein. So he acknowledges this influence, I guess you could say, of Nietzsche on this point. And for me, that second untimely meditation, or I should say unfashionable observation, because that's the Stanford University Press title.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I actually like that one better. That's nice.
Yeah, unfashionable observations.
That's great. That's great.
So I should, as a company person, I should be using that translation. But anyway, so and that's Nietzsche's 1873 very early articulation of how we should relate to our past, right? And that will eventually, by 1887, become genealogy. And on the genealogy of morality, that same method will kind of get worked out, and genealogy will be a kind of simultaneously monumental, antiquarian, and critical method. Those are the three kind of ways of doing history that Nietzsche kind of wraps up into a whole, or into a serial whole, really, that depending on your time period, you might more need the monumental engagement with history. You might more need the antiquarian engagement with history. You might more need the critical engagement with history. But all of them are kind of necessary as correctives for one another, because they become too dominant individually. But at any rate, so that kind of complex that Nietzsche lays out there is coming out of his reaction to, again, historicism in 19th century Germany, and the newfound sort of impulse. It's sort of a symptom of what Nietzsche will eventually call the death of God. That is, or it's a phase in the death of God, or the nihilistic kind of consequences of the death of God, insofar as what Nietzsche's diagnosing there is sort of the loss of a fundamental ground for our values and our knowledge and our even how we understand being, how we understand reality. And we used to have God serving that function, grounding all of our moral values, grounding our capacity to know the world, and being the creator, grounding what things are. So we had that ground. And as we lost faith in that thing's capacity to serve that grounding function, then with the Enlightenment, we switched to reason. Now, reason could function as that ground. It could ground our values if we and everyone has access to it. So it'd be this universally available ground that we could use to ground our values and our ability to know things. And once again, the rational explanation of the world is the reason for its existing, right? The principle of sufficient reason. Everything is because it has a sufficient reason to be, and therefore rationality is sort of the ground for reality itself. And then as that sort of moves out of, it becomes less tenable, the Enlightenment association with reason, now history steps in, and history becomes that fundamental principle that is, well, okay, maybe the world isn't the creation of God and we can't depend on it. Maybe it's not even fundamentally rational and reason can't give us access. But maybe if we know precisely enough, and really more importantly for Nietzsche, scientifically enough, the individual elements of any given historical context, we can explain why anything happened. And therefore, we can take that and explain why things should happen in our historical context. That is, we can understand the causes and influences of any historical event, including our own. And then we can sort of act accordingly. We can understand the world. We understand why the world is the way it is, and we can establish our values basically based on history. And that's the sort of the project of 19th century historicism. And Nietzsche finds that to be toxic. He thinks the scientific study of history is problematic, because what it's committed to is knowing everything exhaustively about history without remainder. That is, just knowing everything about history, the entire sort of every single aspect of history, every event that's happened, every minute element of it has to be scientifically studied. And if we do that, we'll arrive at an understanding that will be positive for us. And so, as Nietzsche says, and this is the case for many of his texts, the title of the of the text is really the kind of skeleton key for the whole thing, right? So Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music is the same way, Human All Too Human, Daybreak or Dawn, Gay Science is the same way. Same thing with the second Untimely Meditation, which is on the liability or on the utility and liability of history for life. And that for life thing is really important because his idea is this scientific study of the past is suffocating for our life force because it eclipses the necessity of a future of life's developing into the future and creatively producing new life forms and et cetera. And that sort of obsessive study of the past is having a toxic effect on his historical present and on the force of life. So I think that notion of life in the second unfashionable observation is just one term that he uses for that underlying dynamic creative force or a complex of forces. Mm-hmm. Elsewhere in Birth Tragedy, he'll call it the contentious relationship between the Dionysian and the Apollonian. Mm-hmm. In Philosophy in the Tragic Age, he'll call it just nature. Mm-hmm. And then later on, he'll call it the will or will to power. Yeah. And that's that surging source of creativity that can sort of be expressed in a way that's genuine and proper to itself or can be suffocated. Yeah. And for him, the threefold relationship to history is a way that takes that past and most puts it in the service of life. And I think that's something parallel to what Heidegger's Destruction is doing, digging down to that source out of which Aristotle's concepts were created and allowing us to think now out of that source in a way that was sort of obscured for us previously. So I think they're very parallel in that sense.
Yeah, I think I've always seen Nietzsche's philosophy as a philosophy of life. How do we have life sincerely and accurately and philosophically, but maybe more, even more specific for Heidegger is this idea of of being and how we're able to understand that within the world. So that makes a lot of sense on that overlap. So I guess the question I want to lead into here is about concepts. So how are we to think of concepts, I guess, generally, what it is, definitions, how do we understand a concept in its conceptuality, and how do these all play a part? We can start with that and then kind of break it down a little bit of what Aristotle's doing with some of these concepts.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Xavier. So, as I mentioned earlier, the focus for Heidegger in these destructive readings of Aristotle's text are always these Grundbegriffe, or these grounding concepts, these ground concepts, and he's constantly trying to sort of dig into the foundation, the experiential sort of soil out of which Aristotle's pulling those concepts. And interesting, I guess, is that to me at least, is that later on Heidegger will really sort of engage more in a critique of conceptual thinking as such. So in 1951's What is Called Thinking, for instance, Heidegger, he identifies, or he relates, first of all, Begriffe or concepts to the verb greifen, to grasp or to seize, to lay hold of. And he basically there says conceptual thinking is something that is limited to the thinking of present entities, because it sets out using concepts, meaning using ideas that are proper only to things that are fully and exhaustively graspable, things that are fully and exhaustively manageable or masterable. And so conceptual thinking has this sort of fundamentally exhaustively grasping and mastering character. And there Heidegger says, is encouraging us to imagine a kind of thinking that sort of leaves concepts behind. So in that lecture course, conceptual thinking is kind of the target of the Heideggerian critique as such. In these earlier lecture courses from the 1920s, I think there's something more interesting going on, which is that there Heidegger seems to suggest that thinking with concepts, if it's genuine, that is, if it's genuine to the conceptuality of the concept, if it incorporates this idea of the Begrifflichkeit of the Begriff, the conceptuality of the concept, then it can be a sort of, it can think in a post-metaphysical way. We can bring concepts into this post-metaphysical project, and we can think with concepts, but we have to think our concepts differently. We have to think them, he says that, right, in their Begrifflichkeit. And what that essentially means is that we can't think them as reducible to an essential definition any longer. So say the concept of the human. From Aristotle, we have the well-known definition of the human as the animal with logos or reason or language, right? So if we imagine concepts to be definable in that mode, then what we think is that the definition is a logical unit that can replace this concept, human, in any logical relations. We can put it into a proposition. We can, and the proposition will still be true if the definition for the human replaces the concept human. So if we, instead of human, all human beings are mortal, we say all rational animals are mortal. If that was true of humans, and it's now true with it will be true of the proposition rearticulated using the definition all rational animals are human. So we think there of definitions as replacements for concepts in logical relations that are exhaustively applicable, right? They exhaustively replace the concept. But Heidegger wants to think them in their conceptuality, which means to incorporate a kind of verbal notion of the concept. That is, try to think of the concept human as a conceiving, that is, a confrontation with a bunch of entities that seem to call forth the term human, and a sort of relating to all of those entities, and then a bringing them together, identifying what's like about them, and articulating that likeness in the concept human being. But now our notion of the concept human being has within it that confrontation with preconceptual experience. Now it's an invention, right? It's emerging out of experience that is not yet organized according to the concept, and it is organizing that experience into the concept. Now it's a creation. And so it's not totally disconnected from reality. It's not a mere fiction, right, but it is a creation based on experience that is preconceptual, that's not yet organized according to this concept that we're just coming up with. So that's the main idea, I think, in Heidegger's reading of Aristotle, that if conceptual thinking can begin to understand its concepts as these kind of accomplishments, as creations in the face of experience that is in excess of the concept, then that kind of thinking can go forward, and it won't be the mastering, exhaustively grasping kind of thinking that he critiques later on in what is called thinking.
Yeah, so let me see if I can build on this. So taking this idea of like human, if you have this definition, what you're explaining here is that he's basically saying that you want to get the whole gestalt of what that is. And from that gestalt, you then want to extrapolate the kernel of the central idea you create out of the gestalt of the concept that you're deriving from, something like that. Yeah.
I think you're onto something there, Xavier. And the only thing I would add to that is just that in thinking concepts in this new way, we would sort of hold them as necessarily incomplete. That is, they would be concepts of something. This field of the concept human would belong to and mean to stand in for the sum total of all human beings that ever have been, are, or will be. But it would sort of, in a sense, recognize the grounds out of which those human beings appear as humans, and which are necessarily not incorporated into the concept. So now we would have this concept as something that helps us organize our experience, at the same time as the way we have it marks the excess of that experience in a way that it doesn't now. Now we think, well, we've got the concept human. Now that could utterly and completely replace the whole set of all particular humans.
So this is kind of coming on the whole Heraclitus idea of becoming, right? That you have the concept, but it's not a static thing. So even if something that we understand conceptually or how we're defining it, we still have to leave space to say, how is this evolving, or how could we continue to redefine or update this in some way by taking the conglomerate ideas of what that concept is, and we still try to say, okay, we have to budget space for that. It's something like that.
Yeah, no, and I think you're really onto something with the Heraclitus reference there, Xavier, because, and I think this is actually where Nietzsche might be even more interesting than Heidegger on this notion of the concept. Nietzsche says in Philosophy of the Tragic Age of the Greeks that philosophy is concept creation, which is exactly the same definition that Heidegger gives in his readings of Aristotle. Philosophy is concept creation, creation specifically, right? And that's the same definition that Deleuze and Guattari give in what is called philosophy, right? That's concept creation. But what Nietzsche sort of pulls out of those early Greek thinkers, and Heraclitus in particular, is if concepts are going to think this condition of becoming, Heidegger's got it right that they have to record their emergence out of a ground that they don't completely exhaustively incorporate, right? They conceptualize something that they necessarily sort of eclipse potentially and do not fully include. And that indication of a insufficiency now belongs to our concepts in a way that it didn't in the metaphysical mode of thinking concepts. For metaphysics, whatever's lost in not thinking the particularities of the particular humans, right? That this one's got a mustache and that one's shorter than this one, or what, that doesn't really matter. None of it's significant to thinking of the human being. So all the particular grounds or the particular the ontological grounds on the basis of which humans present themselves, none of that's really important. We can replace the whole set of humans with the concept human exhaustively, and we don't lose anything of any significance for metaphysics. Now our concept records its emergence out of that unconceptualized, preconceptual, and ultimately unconceptualized ground. What Nietzsche would add to that is, and this is coming out of that Heraclitean notion of becoming, we also have to hold our concept in a way that includes its own eventual destruction. That concept is an emergence. It comes out of this dynamic ground. We articulate that dynamic ground in a way that helps conceptually. It conceptualizes something about it. But then we embrace the idea that has to be replaced by a new created concept. And that goes for our values as well. That's why Nietzsche wants to sort of think of this transvaluation of values, and you could say transconceptualization of concepts, as an ongoing process. For him, that's the way we should be thinking and holding our values, holding our concepts and holding our values in that way that always includes the fact of their emergence out of grounds that they don't fully incorporate, and their necessary return to that ground, or their necessary destruction.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I can feel all of my follow-up questions on the Nietzsche principle, but I'll save that for our later conversation. So, so now I have this question here, and you can go as deep as you want. If I get lost, I'll tell you, or if you don't want to go too deep, that's fine. But in the book, you talk about this idea of perception with memory and with experience, right? And what Aristotle's doing there. Now, I would imagine that maybe some of this is what we see as long term memory. The reason I'm asking this is because I mentioned it earlier, but in much of uh, neuroscience generally, and neuropsychology or cognitive science, or computational neuroscience, there is this. There's some really good folks out there that are trying to basically have their foot into a foot in both worlds, I guess, philosophy and kind of neuroscience, which I really admire. Now, what kind of philosophy is it? Is it more the analytic tradition or what have you? Maybe I don't know, but I at least respect it. But I think having one, both feet in one camp or whatever than others is a disservice. So the reason I ask this is that many people will look at perception, and how we understand our experience and our perception to make claims from a neuroscientific standpoint of what is reality, what is real, um, you know, how do we understand maybe the neuroscientific aspects or the neurological aspects of memory, or when there are disorders of memory, etc. But that perception is powerful, but it's not only the thing that's there, but how do we understand our reality with us? And you can kind of upload consciousness here to this part of the
Mhm.
equation as well, and that becomes even more messy. So I guess in talking about these ideas of concepts, and we've mentioned at different points here, where does the Aristotelian aspect of perception and memory and experience connect with this idea of concept? And you can go as,
Mhm.
as as deep you want. It's been on my mind recently, especially talking to folks that are doing predictive processing stuff, or how we kind of construct our world around us. And I want to root it in these kind of philosophical, the continental tradition of what Aristotle was up to and what he thought about it, and where Heidegger goes with it, and any other thoughts you may have
Mhm.
on it.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so I'm sorry, Aristotle does offer in two places. So in Posterior Analytics 219 and in Metaphysics Alpha, he offers a kind of sort of hierarchy of what we might refer to as sort of mental faculties.
Uh-huh.
So he talks about, and he sees it as a kind of a hierarchy of beings as well, so that some beings only have the lower level faculties, while certain beings and humans only have the very highest level of faculty. But in that conversation, he talks about the way that we develop. Or he speculates about the way that we develop something like techne, which he refers to as an art or a craft, right? A productive knowledge, basically, a way of knowing things that produces things, or empiria, which is more like a kind of scientific understanding, a knowledge for its own sake.
Yep.
And so he's kind of trying to figure out where those come from and how we build basically an understanding of the world, either that we can use to produce things or that we just know and understand things in a quasi-scientific way.
Mm.
And he says, well, every animal has some kind of perception. Plants have only the nutritive faculties and growth that their souls, are capable of. They don't have perception for Aristotle. Animals are the kind of living thing that has perceptions. There you get the genus and the species. And then he says some of those animals that have perception have also memory. So they seem to be able to retain these perceptions over time. And interestingly, he describes that process of retention as he uses the image of a military force retreating on the battlefield. So they're all running from an opposing military force. And he says every once in a while in a retreat, one soldier will stop and turn and fight and stay where they are.
Mm.
And that lone soldier will then attract the other soldiers, and then they'll stay and hold that position. And he says that's what memory is like, where when you're perceiving things, everything that you're perceiving is just being sort of flooded away, washed away by the next perception. And it's only when one of them sticks that then the next time a like perception passes through, it can stick and stand with that one. So you start to build memories on the principle of like is attracted to like, basically. And then you collect your memories that way. It's not just a random collection of sort of a content of experience. For Aristotle, it's organized according to likeness. That's how memory works. It sort of holds like things together.
We would call this a type of associative learning or associative memory, where we're linking it. We remember things better by linking it to something we've already had, as opposed to just kind of going over it over and over.
Right. Excellent. Yeah. So that's and this is in the context of something like learning a skill or learning to understand something, that he's talking about memory. So it's hard to know exactly how he would imagine memory works, not in that context. So just the way memory works in just living your life. But here, what he says is, well, if you have memory, then you can develop what he calls experience, empiria. It's where we get the word empirical. And that is a kind of collection of memories where you can, it's basically like a familiarity with that thing. So he'll distinguish someone that's maybe like a healer from a doctor. And a healer has enough recollection of, say, the symptoms of scurvy, so that they can, they have a familiarity with scurvy, and they know that when they've given scurvy suffering people citrus fruits, they've improved. So when someone presents themselves with the symptoms of scurvy, then they know they can offer citrus fruit and it will cure the condition, but they don't know why. They know that this is scurvy, but they don't know why scurvy happens, so they don't know why the citrus works to cure it. But a doctor would know the why. So basically, memory for him is a kind of potential for either just familiarity, which is kind of a lower level, or you could move to the next level of a kind of technical understanding, producing healthy patients, or a theoretical understanding, just understanding health in general. And so for Aristotle, that's the way memory works, collecting perceptions according to the principle of like is attracted to like, and then it serves in understanding the world and in the best case scenario.
So when you have these perceptions and you're connecting them, and we have these memories that are creating the type of experience, I guess long term, are we then building concepts out of that, where we're saying, okay, so now I know what this, I'm giving this a category, or I'm giving this a kind of domain. Is it something along those lines? So it is a type of hierarchical kind of, not an A plus B plus C kind of thing, but there is a kind of organized network, if you will, in Aristotle's mind. And then that's how we get to concepts. Is it something like this?
Yeah, exactly. So that thing that was alike in all of those soldiers, that likeness, so for Aristotle, he develops the distinction between the universal and the particular, or what will become the universal and the particular in the Middle Ages. For him, the terminology is interestingly different. He calls the particular ta katekaston, which means the thing according to each. So you're looking at a group of, say, things that present themselves as human beings, and the particulars are humans when seen or perceived according to each one. So you're seeing them each in their particular differences. The universal is the ta katalu, which is the thing according to the whole. So when you look at them all together, what's the thing that they all share? What's the one thing that unifies all of them that's the same in every case? Not all their particular differences, but what's the humanity that they all share? That's your concept. So you draw it out of that collection of individual things. Now, what Heidegger thinks is that way of creating a concept, Aristotle passes on to the tradition. What he really did is more along the lines of having the world present itself to him, have being as the kind of dynamic source and event of the unfolding of beings into appearance. He received that in experience, and out of which he created concepts. And so when Heidegger digs back into the text destructively, he tries to find that subtending ground that wasn't fully incorporated into those concepts that Aristotle passed along. But yeah, that's how Aristotle thinks of himself as creating concepts, as collecting those particulars, viewing them either individually or as a whole. And when you view all those particulars as a whole, you can abstract the concept from all of the shared universal from all of those particulars.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially as looking at how Heidegger sees it. Again, I think listeners will be able to hear that. I mean, Aristotle was, brilliant seems like an understatement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He was so tremendous as a thinker.
Yeah.
And this is pre-modern science in some ways, so
Mm-hmm.
it's incredible. This
I
might be
agree.
a good place to kind of go over the three tactics of the destructive method of reading
Sure.
Aristotle. So the three are, if I have it right, a shift from a static kind of definition to the beings, the concepts mean in the mode of being, right?
Mm-hmm.
From specific vocabulary to terminological choices on the basis of experience of being, and then what is clarifying and more intelligible as a concept and what is not. So just talk about what is Heidegger doing here with this destructive method of reading Aristotle? Give us
Sure.
the full destruction here. What's the full Heideggerian destruction?
Sure. Yeah. So these are the kind of the sort of tactics that he's using in reading the Aristotelian text and focusing in on different concepts. And I give these three kind of examples or case studies of destroyed concepts of ousia, the substance, and the zoon, echon, logon, or the animal having reason or language, and dunamis, or potency. And in each case, he follows these sort of three steps that you mentioned, Xavier. And he sort of suggests these same three steps in the very schematic description of the destructive project that he lays out in the Introduction to Being and Time in paragraph 6. But there, right, that's going to be the second half of Being in Time, which is never written.
Yeah.
And it's just a very sort of schematic indication that this is the destruction we'll have to engage in. And we'll read Kant, and then we'll read Descartes, and then we'll read Aristotle, and we'll give a destruction of the tradition, and that will sort of allow us to think being, to raise the question of being for the first time, which we've forgotten since Aristotle and Plato. We just accepted their interpretation of being, and it's dominated our thinking. It's organized the field of inquiry for the whole history of Western metaphysics, from Aristotle to Heidegger, according to Heidegger. But the method then has these three basic steps, and the first one is shifting the focus from the definitions of concepts that Aristotle gives, or sort of the philosophical positions that he arrives at, and shifting it back to the moment of inquiry, right? The place where he's raising his questions. And Aristotle, this is an interesting observation that Heidegger makes. Aristotle's, because of his scholastic interpretation, often thought of as a kind of system builder, right? And also because his texts are he's sort of inventing philosophical disciplines. In Plato, we don't have a metaphysics, a physics, an epistemology, a logic, an ethics, a politics. Those things are just sort of all mixed together. And Aristotle's the one that says, no, we need these sub areas of study, and we're going to dedicate ourselves to those questions, and which ones are sciences and which ones aren't. So he gets this reputation, and according to his later reception, as a kind of systematic thinker. But when you actually read the text of Aristotle, it's very open. Aristotle's constantly striving for a definition, offering the definition of a concept, giving an argument for an interpretation. And then one of Aristotle's most powerful philosophical turns of phrase is, let's begin again. That happens over and over again in the Aristotelian text. Let's begin again. So then we go back to the original phenomena, the moment where the question of what is an ousia, or what is a human, or what is a dunamis, presents itself, and then we sort of negotiate that initial appearing. So Heidegger's first step in the destruction is to go back to those moments. Let's focus in on those moments where he's initially confronting the appearance of beings, and out of that, he's going to create a concept, but he'll constantly return to that ground, that experiential ground. So the first step is, instead of proceeding the way we would normally in the history of philosophy, which is, what are the thinker's ultimate positions? Let's figure out what Aristotelianism is. And we would say, well, he's an empiricist because he's interested in, concrete experience. He's not an idealist like his mentor Plato. He's this kind of thinker, that kind of thinker. We would assemble all the positions that he arrives at, which are the final moments in his thinking. And Heidegger says, no. For destructive reading, you shift your focus away from those arrived at positions, and you focus on those initial encounters with beings that provoke the question. So what is it that presents itself to Aristotle that initially provokes the question? What is a dunamis or a potency? What is a human? Let's focus on those moments. And then he does two things, basically. He says, well, let's look at the terminology that he assembles to start to make evident that an immediate experience. And the big question Heidegger wants to ask is the terminology inherited from earlier thinkers, or does it come out of the demands of the experience itself? So, for instance, we would ask, when Aristotle looks at a substance, why does he use the term eidos for the forming element, the element that gives form or organizes the material being that's presenting itself? Well, probably because Plato used the term eidos to describe the eternal ideas that he thought were the ultimate realities. And so that's an inherited philosophical term that Aristotle deploys at this moment in trying to make sense of his immediate experience. And for Heidegger, that's suspect, right? Because it's not necessarily, it might be, but it isn't necessarily being required by the content of the experience itself. And then the second step, once we've shifted our focus and sort of focused on the terminology and where it comes from, then we look at what is it precisely that Aristotle counts as increased intelligibility, right? So we have an experience, it's question worthy. That's why we're still talking about it, while we're inquiring into it. We experience it as withholding itself from our understanding. What does Aristotle think counts as an increase in intelligibility? What is it how does he determine that this thing is becoming more intelligible? What exactly are the criteria according to which he says, this helps us make this more intelligible than it was when it initially presented itself to questioning? And those are the three steps.
Yeah, I think it's well, in seeing that, right, you can see, well, if going back to the beginning, if Heidegger was doing a positive destruction, he wasn't doing something different. He was trying to take what was already there with Aristotle's framework and saying, well, how do we extract from the foundation of being what is in there, right? And using it this way, you could see makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. No, you're totally right, Xavier, and I think that's exactly right. That what Heidegger is really revealing or disclosing in the Aristotelian text is there in a sense, but it's kind of in an unexpected place. It's not at the conclusion of the Aristotelian philosophical study. It's the thing that was initially provoking that study, the initially question-worthy experience of the world. In that, there's an indication of being that's in excess of metaphysics.
Yeah. So where does his notion of, you talk about it, his notion of phenomenological reduction, construction, and destruction all tie in together to understand Aristotelian texts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So he, in 1927, so this is the same year that The Being and Time comes out, Heidegger gives a lecture course called The Basic Problems of Phenomenology. And in that text, he sort of presents a really fascinating complication, I guess we could say, of Husserl's phenomenological method. Husserl had introduced the reduction, the epoche, where basically we begin with our natural attitude, our natural way of perceiving the world. And in that natural attitude, when something presents itself to consciousness, I've got a representation of, say, a tree that I'm perceiving. My natural attitude is to assume that this object of consciousness that I recognize as a tree arises from an object that is a tree beyond consciousness. So that's the natural attitude. I have that. I presume that the contents of my conscious experience refer to things in the world. And Husserl says, well, what we need to do is sort of suspend that natural attitude so that we can focus on the contents of consciousness itself, this representation. What are the conditions for the arising of this appearance? And that's the phenomenological project.
Yeah, I just want to jump in there. I've heard it seen in terms of a bracketing.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Which to be clear, when I've taught students this, they get very confused sometimes about this, which makes a lot of sense. But it's not that you don't have your natural kind of mode of approach. It's saying you may still pick that up or you may incorporate it, but you want to bracket it first to try and get at the phenomenological, the actual experience, the existence before you get to whatever else you want to put into it beforehand, to try to get the thing itself. And then you can pick up what your kind of natural occurrence is and see if you want to continue to do that or you update it or not. So it's not that you totally just put it in the trash. You're putting it on the shelf. You're bracketing that. And then to try and get at the thing itself, because you're trying to get at the core elements of it, because then that's going to give, springing out of that is going to give you more of a 360 view or a more robust view of the thing itself, which would then, basically you're trying to do this kind of investigation of what you're, observing or what have you. And that you can't do that unless you bracket first your kind of natural predisposition towards coming to it, because of many of the things that are nice about what we come to also kind of give us a kind of myopic way of looking at things. And that's not the thing that you don't want to do. Is that about right here?
Yeah, no, I think that bracketing is that term really is helpful. And in that notion of bracketing or suspending the judgments that you make about
right.
the reality that you imagine must correspond to the content of your conscious experience, right? Yep, that's absolutely right. And so when we reduce our investigation, our field of investigation with Husserl to just the content of consciousness, and we no longer engage in that natural attitude's tendency to imagine this to be revealing the world beyond conscious experience, the physical world or the external world. We sort of just, as you said, set that aside methodologically, just for the purpose of this methodological study of the contents of consciousness, to see what we can know. For Heidegger, that's what means Husserl is still operating within that Cartesian subject-object relation. It's one of the things that indicates that, because it shows that he's thinking of the subject as the ultimate ground of these conscious experiences and can be disconnected from the objects that are being perceived or being imagined or being hoped for or whatever. You can separate off those objects from the contents of consciousness. Whereas Heidegger, if this subject is not a subject at all, but a Dasein, a being in the world, then all of this is already the world showing itself to us and Dasein's sort of connectedness to the world. But so for Heidegger, he says, we do need a phenomenological reduction, but we don't reduce from our natural attitude's tendency to claim to see the content of our experience as connected to an external world, and withdraw that to the content of consciousness itself or experience itself. Rather, we reduce from beings to being. We show that being, not not the structures of intelligibility that belong to consciousness, not those as the conditions for the appearance of a being, but being as the condition for the appearance of a being. So we reduce down to being. We dig beneath, we ask after, as part of our new radicalized phenomenological methodology, we ask after being as the subtending ground of the appearance of beings. So Heidegger says we reduce down to being as the ground of beings. And that's the new reduction. It's not reducing beings to the structures of subjectivity. It's reducing beings to the ground of being that allows for them to present themselves as beings. So that's the first step. But then and then he says, and what we need to supplement that is a destruction. That is, we have to take apart those traditional influences that tend to require of us only a focus on beings. We need to interrupt those destructively, showing their sort of genealogical development out of these moments in the history of philosophy, so that we enable ourselves to engage in that reductive moment. And by the way, the reduction, destruction, and construction are all one maneuver. It's all simultaneous. It's not that you would do them in series or something like that. So the destruction is supporting the capacity to reduce down to this subtending ground of being. And then the most fascinating one for me is construction. Yeah. That an essential part of the phenomenological method for this 1927 Heidegger is constructing a notion of being, because being is precisely that which by definition can't present itself to experience. It's the subtending ground for the appearance of beings, for beings to present themselves, but it necessarily eclipses itself in being the condition for this appearing. So what our thought focuses on are these beings that it allows to appear, but it's the event of their appearing that necessarily is withheld from our experience of those beings. And so we have to construct that. It's almost, elsewhere throughout the 20s, he'll talk about it in terms of creativity. He'll talk about it in terms of the philein, or loving, that belongs to the philosophical project, the loving of wisdom, that distance that opens up between our object being, what we're trying to think. So, but here he talks about it as construction. We need to construct a notion of being, sort of project out beyond the content of our experience. And that's an essential part of really engaging in the phenomenological project.
I'm as you're talking about the construction piece here, it is curious. I'm immediately jumping to a little bit later Heidegger, where he has this wonderful long essay on the question of art. Is this right? No, no, it's the question concerning technology. But there's a big
the origin of the work of art.
Yeah, the origin of the work of art. And I believe he and Nietzsche both believed very strongly that art is the seat of truth, right? That's where you get truth. You don't get it from all these other things. You get it from there. Is some of this kind of triptych kind of reduction, construction, destruction, construction also kind of seen in, if you were talking in terms of creativity or things like that? Is that where kind of, art comes into play here too? As you're constructing is something that it's a literal covering when you're doing art in different, obviously, mediums. Now we could have there's another a trail here of saying, well, what is art? That's a different question necessary. But in terms of here, this art where you can kind of get out from that being of this truth that is art, is that kind of another aspect of this construction piece that he's talking about, or in even his earlier work, but kind of comes about in a different way in this big essay here?
Yeah, I think so, Xavier. I would say that there's a sort of a similar dynamic that's being approached from different sides. So on the one hand, the work of art, right, is this. What's fascinating about a work of art is that it's distinct from a work of, say, mechanistic production, right? So when as you said, we might disagree about what qualifies as a work of art, but we have these two different categories, and one is a work of art, and the other thing is just a produced object, right? And so one fascinating thing is, well, okay, if you have a work of art and it's grounded in the materiality of the thing that it's produced, it seems to relate to that material ground differently than the merely fabricated object, the non-artistically fabricated object. That seems to sort of be a situation where the form organizes the material for use. But with a work of art, there's something kind of quasi-miraculous by definition present there. Even maybe somebody will come along and say, well, I don't agree that there are works of art. There's only fabricated. Okay, that's fine. That's a position. But if you have the category, available to you that there are works of art, there are material objects that are constructed artistically, then the question is, okay, well, how does that thing relate differently to, how does that form organize its material ground differently than the fabricated object? And I think what we have is a kind of abyssal ground that the art object points down to in a way that the fabricated object doesn't, as we normally experience them. Now, elsewhere, Heidegger will say even ordinarily fabricated objects can do this if you have the right sort of attitude toward them, like a jug. He'll talk about that, and or he'll talk about a tower on the landscape as sort of doing this. But in the work of art essay, it's artistic objects have this kind of special ability to present themselves and point to a ground out of which they emerge that they don't give you, that withholds itself. And so for Heidegger, he wants to say that's a work of art, and works of art point to that. Here, I think in the construction, in this notion of krisis that you mentioned earlier, that Heidegger, I think, is draws out of Aristotle, that Werner Marx picks up on. So krisis as separation, that is, and Marx says basically, in our attitude of questioning, we experience, or investigating, we experience a krisis. And krisis comes from krinein, the Greek word which means to separate or to cut, right? To divide from one another. So a krisis is a separation. So when we're investigating a subject matter, we experience that separation. We experience its distance from us, right? That's why we're investigating. If we possessed it completely and knew it utterly, we wouldn't be investigating it. It's withholding itself that is recorded in our activity of questioning and investigating. And what I think what Heidegger wants to suggest, he draws our attention to this idea of krisis and critical science, critical thinking, krisis in relation to that critic, that kritische notion in German. And I think the idea is, what we usually imagine is that krisis, or that separation, through the investigation is overcome. If the investigation is successful, we would do away with this separation, this division, and we would get immediate access to the thing, ideally, and we would know it completely. And what Heidegger wants to suggest is, no, the krisis has to stay. We have to have a way of thinking the thing where we allow it to withhold itself, where it doesn't give itself utterly and completely. And part of its not giving itself utterly and completely to our understanding would be it's pointing down to this ground that we can't get perfect access to. So the limit to the intelligibility of the work of art that it points to, its sort of abyssally grounded character that makes it kind of miraculous, Heidegger wants to say that's what we experience, that separation in the questioning moment, and we need to figure out a way to hold on to that, allowing something to remain withdrawn or separate from us, and include that in how we know it. Now we know it, but we don't overcome that separation completely. And that's a kind of what this phenomenological mode of thinking would allow for, because we would be constructing its ground rather than presuming to utterly reveal it or disclose it.
Yeah. It's just so is just so rich
Yeah.
in kind of a way of thinking about, you know, kind of just ways of being,
Mm.
for us as humans, even now, of course. And I think that that's really important. So the last question I have is what can we what's the final punchline here? If people reading your work, what do you want them to kind of walk away? Kind of the bottom line, I guess. What's the thing that you want to take away is about Heidegger's positive destruction of Aristotle and ergo tradition, and how can we just, I guess, maybe use some of that to look at philosophy more generally?
Yeah, thanks. I think so. My pitch in the book is that this is a peculiarly powerful method for engaging with the tradition of Western metaphysics, the tradition of interpreting being that we inherit. So my idea is that if you inherit this tradition today, there are people in the world who remain perhaps untouched by that Western tradition, untouched by its influence, untouched by Aristotelian ontology, and for them, then this doesn't apply. But if you find yourself sort of under the influence of this tradition, and you find that tradition today to be suspect, which I think we do in a really profound and uh, newly threatening way, I guess I'd say, insofar as for a long time we would critique our tradition in the war, not fairly recently, but it was possible to critique our traditional, the tradition of, say, Western philosophy. And that critique took the form of we had concepts in Western thought, but we misapplied them. So, for instance, we could look at the shameful tradition of slavery in the U.S., and we could say, well, that's an instance of where we had the concept of human beings, but we misapplied it. We said it only belongs to these people of this type, and it doesn't belong to those people of those type. And so that's a misapplication of concepts. So we could say, well, we've done a poor job of applying our concepts in the West. And that's one way of critiquing the tradition. But I think now we're suspicious in a deeper sense. We are suspicious that maybe our very concepts themselves have tendencies toward exclusion or marginalization, biases sort of baked in. And now we're wondering how we can think, how we proceed in the project of thinking if our very concepts themselves are now open to questioning. It's not just the application of concepts, but the concepts themselves. And I think Heideggerian destruction gives us a really powerful way of digging back into the ground of those concepts, showing that ground out of which, that rich, not entirely incorporated ground out of which they emerged, and then thinking newly and differently with those concepts potentially. So that's what I think the book makes an argument for in terms of the value and potential function of Heidegger's destruction of Aristotle.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was definitely very convincing for me. I'll say I really enjoyed the argument you put forth, and it was so nice to read two of my favorite thinkers together. I really like that kind of work, this kind of comparative kind of thing, or this interaction, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so again, the book is Heidegger and the Destruction of Aristotle and How to Read the Tradition. Where can folks find this book, and where are the best places to find yourself?
Sure. Yeah, it'll be out July 2023 with Northwestern University Press. So please look into it. And the as far as I'll be probably doing a little bit of related work in the coming months, I guess, and maybe year on Heidegger and Aristotle at the North Texas Heidegger Symposium this spring, and onward maybe at the Ancient Philosophy Society as well, maybe next year. So those are venues where I would be presenting this work.
That's great. That's wonderful. Well, Sean, this was a lot of fun. I mean, the time always goes by very quickly, and you've been really generous with your time. I would say we could talk for a lot longer, but I know it would be very nice to get you back on here again with all of your other work that you're working on. So it really was a very fulfilling conversation, at least for me. So I'm very grateful for you having the conversation for a couple hours.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me, Xavier. It was a real pleasure.
Yes, same.